This is Euroscopic, your weekly roundup of what happened, what's happening, and what might happen in and to Europe. In partnership with EU Observer, we bring you insights and reporting from their people on the ground across the European Union and beyond, plus interviews with European policymakers and analysts. I'm William Glucroft, a journalist who writes the Germany Substack newsletter called The Schland.
And I am Martin Gack, author of Inconclusive Thoughts.
We're recording on Tuesday, May 21st, 2024. We'll be discussing the ICC warrants for top Hamas and Israeli leaders, the new composition of the Dutch government, the U.S. trying to sway Georgia away from its foreign agents bill and what that means for the EU. And we have a fantastic interview with Johnny Ryan, the director of Enforce, the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, on a far-reaching look at what the European Commission, the next one, might have to face in terms of technology and our democracy. That's all coming up right after this.
So, William Glucroft, what do we have for this week?
Well, here I am again, landing back in The Hague, stumbling off a train miraculously on time, despite Deutsche Bahn's best efforts to delay me. And just when you think it can't get more exciting or more interesting or more relevant or timely to be in The Hague, it does. It gets more of all of those things, right? I've been to the International Court of Justice now twice, and of course was listening in last week from Berlin to the South Africa-Israel oral hearings on yet more provisional measures that South Africa is requesting. And now, of course, we have finally a new Dutch government and these International Criminal Court warrants or petitions for warrants for top Israeli and Hamas officials. So it's been a busy week, and it all seems to be focusing all around where I am in The Hague, in the Netherlands. And I take no credit for this. I don't think I'm like the center of international law universe because of me, of course.
I just thought that great news was following you around.
Yeah, I don't want, we shouldn't confuse causation and correlation, right? Me being here, I'm not sure it has any impact. But, we can speculate about that. And what do we do best on podcasts but to speculate?
So anyway, I mean, it's a huge story. It came very unexpectedly on a Sunday.
Yeah, that's right. There's been rumors of it. People have been almost wishing for it into existence, that the ICC would act, kind of following on the heels of the ICJ. Obviously, two very different courts that act very differently, have very different scopes and jurisdictions and ways that they go about pursuing charges and trials. And looking at the evidence of various violations of international law. And it finally came out, right? I believe CNN had the exclusive first, and then it was announced officially, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court actually issuing requests for arrest warrants for top Hamas and Israeli officials. Those Israeli officials, of course, being Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, and Yoav Gallant, the Israeli defense minister, and three top Hamas leaders who are still alive. And interesting that one of them, being the political leader, he's in Qatar, which, as we in our previous episode, we had our interview with a former chief prosecutor of the ICC, and he made that good point of, if Israel was so concerned about and so interested and dedicated to destroying Hamas, why haven't they gone after the money? Why haven't they gone after things that funnel through Qatar and Turkey? There's been very little of that. And so the ICC is actually, in ways, doing something that Israel has not done, which is actually going after not just the military side of Hamas, but the political side as well.
It was kind of incredible because I think across the board, the sense was that this was simply not going to happen. I mean, most people I talked to were essentially treating this as some sort of pipe dream that the ICC would ever actually really go after. Sorry, that is my assistant. Would ever really go after Netanyahu, much less, the entire top of the Israeli political machine. I think that what I find remarkable about this is the fact that, well, what you have is not only the search of a warrant, but you also have now the equivalency, as the Israelis have very quickly sort of pointed out, of Hamas actions and Israeli actions in terms of crimes. And predictably, the Israelis came out to talk about, Karim Khan and the ICC essentially being an anti-Semitic outfit. And, how dare they compare a terrorist organization with a democracy? But I think what is worth pointing out is that this is not a discussion about, political systems. This is a discussion or a question about the nature of certain acts undertaken by institutions, whether they are actually criminal or not. So I think in a sense, my position, I suppose is quite near to yours, is that this is something we should really welcome, because if anybody's under the illusion that Israel has not really committed crimes, they will have the chance actually to prove the point. They will have the day in court, as people say. So let me ask you, what is the reaction in Berlin? The reaction in France has been quite positive. The reaction in Spain has been quite positive, so as expected. The reaction in Washington, London, and Berlin, not so much, has it?
Yeah, they've definitely been playing off the same talking points bingo card, almost using identical language about how dare you, make a false equivalence between Hamas and Israel. A little bit of a fact check. It's not a false equivalence. The charges are different. If you read the statement from the ICC chief prosecutor and listen to his statement, his video statement, the charges are different. And I thought Joe Biden was a bit of a distraction, talking about how Israel has not committed genocide. On that point, the ICC agrees with him. The prosecution agrees with him, because the charge of genocide is not included on the ICC, on the list of charges that this warrant includes. So a lot of this is a lot of posturing and political rhetoric. It's very, I shouldn't say it, it's surprising to hear this from Germany and the US and the UK, but it is undermining everything they talk about when it comes to, universal values.
Indeed, a very interesting charge to read in the list was the charge of extermination.
Yeah, and that is probably, if I were to guess, well, Netanyahu would call this anti-Semitism no matter what, because he loves overusing and abusing the term anti-Semitism when really he means this is something bad for me politically or personally. But I assume, and this really is just an assumption because of course I'm not inside the room, but that term extermination, of course, has great historical relevance and salience, because that's, of course, what Germany did to the Jews. So to hear that word in this context it couldn't have been an accident that they've used this word. The chief prosecutor is not dumb to history. Again, an assumption, but I think it's a safe assumption that they know full well what they're talking about when they say extermination.
That charge was actually used on both sides. Both sides were actually accused of extermination. I think that this is clearly going to be with us for quite a while, because it has actually not only upped the antes, but it has actually delivered what many people expected from governments and expected from the International Court of Justice. It seems it was in the end for the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to really put the chips on the table and really sort of make the move, right? So what about Berlin? Berlin's reaction has been also as expected, right?
Yeah, they came out with a statement, this tortured statement of, we support the ICC and international institutions and the rule of law, but all of this is nonsense, and how dare you compare Israel to Hamas, which is a classic Israel talking point, both during the various Bibi Netanyahu governments and also before him. They kind of like to have their cake and eat it too. On one hand, Israel likes to say how it's a democratic state, the only democracy in the Middle East. It stands for the higher values and has a more moral character than all of its neighbors. But then when they get accused of doing bad things, they say, well, look at our neighborhood, we have to do bad things. So it's one or the other, right?
Okay, so on a final point on the matter, today Netanyahu's office released a video of Netanyahu telling the world that Karim Khan, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, stands with the worst anti-Semites of history. Talk about the realization of anti-Semitism. Hitler, Goebbels, Heinrich, Torquemada, the pogrom perpetrators of
the French government during the Dreyfus Affair,
Exactly. All of those have now received in the club one more man, a lawyer, who actually put out a warrant to investigate war crimes. So
right. Maybe Netanyahu will be welcoming his mere corruption charges in Israel in place of having to potentially face these much more serious international charges.
At this point, he should just turn himself in, right? So just to avoid spending the rest of his life having to share lunch with Hamas members in the Hague prison.
Right. Although I think we should point out that the chances of any of these people really ever facing trial on the ICC, even if the ICC accepts these warrants, which there's strong speculation that they will, otherwise they wouldn't have been filed in the first place, is very rare or very unlikely, right? Israel is not party to the ICC. The U.S., its greatest ally, is not party to the ICC. But, of course, it does have the practical potential of limiting where people like Netanyahu can go, right? Because if he visits a state, much like Vladimir Putin's problem, if he visits a state that is part of the ICC, that state would be in a sticky situation whether to arrest Benjamin Netanyahu and extradite him to The Hague to face these charges, or violate international law and their own treaty obligations and let him go back to Israel.
This is a particularly delightful problem facing Germany. I mean, do excuse my Schadenfreude, as they say here, but, countries like Germany would be actually hard-pressed to deal with this because they would actually be obligated to arrest Netanyahu. And it's most certainly something that I'm looking forward to seeing, should it come to that. But, I mean, I think that the question is much bigger, to be quite honest, than the question of prosecution. I think that the issue now is really the political implications of an international court really trying to, take the process forward. So anyhow, I mean, I think that this is really momentous. I mean,
yeah, I think it's worth saying, for our purposes, since we are not an international law podcast, and we're certainly not a Middle East podcast, or we're not a genocide podcast, we are a European podcast. I think it's important for our purposes to understand the impact that this has on the EU, on European countries. That this, to whatever extent that the Russia war in Ukraine has undermined this whole idea of liberal values and values are for everybody and everybody deserves the same rights and access to opportunities, et cetera, and safety. The war in Gaza has further undermined that in terms of contradictions and double standards. And now these warrants will even further make clear how much this double standard really is in place if the U.S. and Germany and countries like it are going to protect Benjamin Netanyahu from international law and feed other leaders that they don't like to the wolves.
Okay, so that's it for Israel, which will loom large over this. Let's talk very briefly about Ukraine. Zelensky has now gone the distance and has asked for allies and sympathizers to send troops into the war theater and confront directly Russia. I have serious doubts that anybody other than Macron, if he gets drunk in the middle of the night, would actually pull the trigger. But it is sort of a very serious shift in tone, right? We could do it by ourselves, just give us the weapons. Now we have the weapons, we cannot do it by ourselves, please send in the boys.
Yeah, I don't see this really happening. I mean, that's direct confrontation with Russia, right? We've been talking about this since the war began in February 2022. That said, the Ukraine is seriously a serious candidate for joining the European Union, which is a can of worms in its own right. And how that would work, a country actively at war, actively under threat. Forget about NATO and Article 5. Even the EU, joining the EU in a war situation where its territory is constantly changing. I don't know how that even. I fail to be able to imagine what the EU looks like with Ukraine part of it in the current situation.
I think that the fact is that enlargement in many, many senses has been a bit of a failure. And I think that you can see this with the usual suspects. But the fact is that you also have, failed enlargement that has itself proven to be a bit of a blessing, right? For instance, Turkey. Can you imagine what the current conditions in Brussels would be, were Erdogan solidly anchored in the European institutions? So I think that it's not only the current conditions in Ukraine. I think that Ukraine is undesirable for the EU, even under ideal conditions of peace and democracy. Because the fact is that in my view, I mean, the proclivity to, having essentially a very strong pro-Putin or pro-Kremlin government will simply not go away. It doesn't matter how much of a good intention, how many euros Brussels pipes into the country, it will still be a gateway for some very unsavory political movement. So anyhow, with that, because we have a very long and absolutely brilliant interview with Johnny Ryan, we're going to leave it at that. And perhaps you want to tell us who Johnny Ryan is, who is coming right up.
Besides a fabulous interview partner and someone just so smart on big issues, he is the director of Enforce, the Irish Council for Civil Liberties. He joined us from Dublin. He's also a senior fellow of Open Markets Institute, and he's basically traded his black hat for a white hat. He used to be in marketing and advertising and he was basically a tech bro, right? Working for and in Silicon Valley. And he kind of gave that up to look at all of the underbelly of all of that and how that's impacting our democracy, how that's impacting transparency, how that's impacting really, our slide to techno-feudalism, right? We're all kind of slaves to the AI-driven data profiles that are out there and being bought and sold by various nebulous actors. And all of this we talked about in a long and extensive interview that Martin and I both thought was interesting and fascinating to run in its full length, and we hope you will too.
Johnny Ryan, thank you very much for being with us. In the last couple of weeks, an article of yours appeared related to the EPP, the European People's Party, in which you are essentially offering a bit of a warning as to what the impact of current digital politics could be on European way of life, essentially. And you're issuing not demands exactly, but at least some guidelines as to what you think should happen with the next commission in terms of, and the next parliament in terms of digital policy. Can you maybe lead us a bit through your account of where we are and what we're standing against and what the road ahead looks like?
Yes, Martin. And I think it's an important moment as we look down the road, because although every new commission is important, I think this new commission will be particularly important. It will decide not only what the next half decade looks like for all Europeans, but it may actually decide whether Europe persists as we understand it. So the 6 horsepersons or horsemen of the apocalypse are a basket of problems that the new Commission president will be confronted with as soon as she or he sits down in their chair later this year. So let me take you through them. The first horseman of the apocalypse is the collapse of the quality of information in our democracy. Now, we can see and feel that this is happening, and there's probably 2 main reasons for it. There may be others too. The first of those reasons is that the online advertising system, which is what pays for nearly all information online, is broken. It's riddled with fraud. It is leaking data about people who read stories on the internet all over the place. There's a data free-for-all. Now, that free-for-all, oddly, it undermines expensive to produce journalism, and it allows a business model, a kind of a data arbitrage business model, for the bottom of the web, for the clickbait, for the rubbish that costs almost nothing to produce, and for disinformation. And just to give you a flavor of that, the online advertising system, by tracking where people go, it opens the door to ad fraud bots, to software that pretends to be people who go on a journey across the internet. And that allows criminals to divert, and the estimates are in the billions, by the way, billions of euro out of newsrooms that produce expensive journalism and divert that money into the pockets of criminals. So that's the first half of the first horseman. It's the broken ad system. We need something better. And everything I've described is also, of course, illegal. The second part of the collapse of information in our democracy is what's happening on social media. Now, often we hear about the need for things to be taken down for content moderation. The real problem, though, is not that something's published on social media, because the mere fact of publishing something does not mean it'll be seen. The real problem is that the social media firms have algorithms, and we know this, of course, now, that select things that are most likely to be emotive, salacious, to keep you hooked onto your feed. And what those systems do is they build a very intimate picture of Martin or of William or of me, Johnny, and they figure out what's going to push our buttons, often our darkest buttons, and then that's what they do. And that is artificially amplifying hate, hysteria. It's promoting suicide and self-harm among our children. It's making our teens hate themselves and their bodies. It's turning our communities against each other. So I've lingered for a long time on that first horseman of the apocalypse, but it really cannot be overstated. What happens when you let the quality of information in a society, in a democracy, tumble in the way we have allowed that to happen? Now, the second horseman is, in a sense, a child of the first. If you have an ad system that is so broken that it relies on sending information about what everyone on the internet is watching, reading, and listening to, and where they are physically in the world, and sending that information out to countless parties without any control over those data, that data free-for-all allows anyone at all who would like to interfere and manipulate in a European election. It allows them to profile any of us. Now, that sounds like a big claim, and you might think, well, the political parties in my country wouldn't do that because they're just not savvy enough. I'm less worried about that political party that isn't yet savvy enough to do that, and I'm more worried about the actor outside of your jurisdiction, outside of your member state, and that's a real fear. Now, the third horseman is very...
Can I interrupt you for a second? I mean, how broad and how widespread do you think this kind of meddling with electoral processes, particularly based on the fact that, this intimate portraits of, voters across the board are basically moving through the system and are being exchanged? I mean, how far do you think this has gone in terms of Europe, and particularly perhaps in view of the coming European elections?
Okay, the answer is we cannot know. It's totally unknowable. All that we can know is how much data about us is going out. And we have a rough picture of how many people get it in the first instance. So let me give you a picture of that. About May, I think, 2022, we at ICCL in Force published a report about the online advertising system, specifically about something called real-time bidding, Martin, which is the system that works behind the scenes on almost every website and app. And what we found by using the industry's own systems, and I used to work in that industry, is that in the US and in the EU together, this system is tracking and sharing what people view online and where they're moving online. Every person, okay? It's doing that in total around about 178 trillion times a year across the US and Europe. Now, those numbers make no sense. So let me just give you a bit of context. On average, a person in Europe will have their activity exposed in this way 376 times a day on average. And that's taken from a 30-day period. And we didn't have data for Facebook or for Amazon. So that's a low figure. Now, when you take a look at the list of where even a company like Google sends a European's data to, you will see companies based in China. You'll see companies based in Russia. Now, after the sanctions, let's hope the data no longer go to Russia. But actually, they're going all over the world. And this ties into the third horseman. And the third horseman is war and security. So a few months ago, we released a report showing that there's a hidden national security crisis. Posing as a company interested in buying data, we went and obtained from the data industry and from some parties there, we went and obtained a list of all of the types of information that we could buy about a person. And the kind of fields we ended up receiving were things like member of the judiciary, bankruptcy, cancer, STDs, that kind of thing.
My God.
And I remember going through the list, and I'll give you an example, Martin, of the kind of things I found. When I went through the list and I found employees of, I think the company was called GFK, maybe. I was wondering who GFK is. And I went and I searched, and I found out quite a lot of information about that company. They had just won the contract to service the landing gear of the Dutch F-35 fleet. So what we were learning in this piece of research, and we reported on this then, I think in November last year, in Europe's hidden security crisis, was that not only is there a data free-for-all in the ad system of all voters, that data free-for-all exposes our sensitive personnel, our industry leaders, our politicians, everybody. Now,
when you say expose, what do you mean by expose? Like, what is connect that final dot for us. What is the danger then?
Okay, let's imagine, William, that you are in a trade negotiation with the European Union as a whole. Maybe you're coming up with some sort of trade treaty, and your side has information about the lead negotiator on the other side. For example, this is a very prosaic example. And let's imagine I am your counterpart and you want to compromise me. You could find out that I'm spending an awful lot of my time in a cancer ward, for example. So I'm under a lot of stress. Maybe it's a family member, maybe it's me. You can find out that I'm searching for medications. Maybe it's like erectile dysfunction or something. You could find out that I'm browsing, divorce lawyers. So there's lots of reasons for stress. But also, among the fields of information that we could buy, I remember in Germany, for example, the marketplace of data brokers we were using had data on whether a person was conscientious, trustworthy, and so forth. These are the kind of Cambridge Analytica metrics, if you recall. So the question is, am I now open to a bribe? It's not just, am I highly stressed? And if it's about, to take a more exciting example, if it's only merely about location, you can not just see that I'm going from the sensitive medical facility to the place where I can get a payday loan, for example. And you can not only see what my financial situation is, but actually you can see far more dangerous things. In that report in November, we put in a half page about a company called Patterns, Patterns. Patterns is an example of a type of surveillance firm that uses these data. It happens to be Israeli. And in their demo of their product, they say, using this data, real-time bidding data, and these people say they came out of the real-time bidding industry, you can pinpoint your target's frequent driving routes. So this is getting into drone strike territory. You can target their most frequent driving routes. You can have alerts to see when they are close to other targets of interest. You can find out who their colleagues are and who their children are. And that's a quote, by the way. You can find out who their children are. So, if I were still in the real-time bidding industry, I might call some of those claims a little bit far-fetched. I'm not sure it's very good for right up to the second data, which is why they're talking about most frequent driving routes rather than where you are right now. But what we can see is that every sensitive industry, every sensitive leader across the union and in the member states right now is having their data vented to anyone who wants it. So it's not just about as a voter.
You said earlier that this is criminal behavior. Is it though? Are there actually, because the problem you seem to be suggesting here is that there isn't the appropriate regulation. There aren't the laws on the books. These are the challenges that the next European Commission is going to have to face. So is it actually criminal, any of this that you're describing?
It's all directly illegal under existing law. We do not need new laws to fix this. What we need is application of the laws. Let me weave this into a complete basket of crisis for you, William, before we get to how to fix the crisis, because...
Right, we still have 4, 5, and 6. We have lots of horses to come.
Yes, exactly. So if you, William, were to become the president of the next commission and you sit down at your table, in the office in the Berlin Mall, you will be thinking about war on your border. You'll be thinking about migration. You'll be thinking about the US one way or the other. You'll have 4 or 5 big issues. And what these 6 horsemen together are is one of those issues. So I'll just elaborate a little bit why. So far we've got collapse of information in the democracy. Obviously, that's enough on its own to threaten the European way of life, but it doesn't sound urgent, does it? Then you've got electoral manipulation. Gets a bit more urgent. And then you've got this issue of security and war. Now, so far in discussing security, I've only talked about the data free-for-all in online advertising. But if you walk around many cities in Europe, it could be Copenhagen, it could be Dublin, many different places, you will see on nearly every public building and nearly every private building the same brand of CCTV camera, the same brand. And in nearly every case, it's Hikvision. Hikvision or Dahua. Both of them are Chinese companies. And if you take a look at Hikvision's financial statements, you can see how heavily subsidized it is by the Chinese state. Now, these cameras, you simply do a quick search, Hikvision camera, I want to buy one for my shop or my house, which you can do. And they will gladly tell you these are internet-connected cameras with facial recognition on the device. Now, what that means is, if, assuming those cameras are phoning home, to use E.T.'s phrase, an identification code for me can just show where I am. You don't need to send all the footage. It's just a few lines of text, and you can see where I've gone throughout the day, how long I've been there, who's near me, and so on. So we have allowed, through our incredibly lax approach to actually enforcing some of our data rules, we have allowed ourselves to be caught in a dragnet of China, but others as well.
So based on what you're saying, it sounds like TikTok, this whole question about TikTok banning it or not is a complete distraction from much bigger security loopholes.
I would say it's part of a bigger picture. TikTok is a very easy target. It's now safe to go after TikTok. But the question is, why did these TikTok problems arise since we already had the structures to deal with them? Now, one of the reasons why we've ended up in this situation is the fourth horseman, which is that we have completely broken digital markets. We know that a few really big companies have swallowed the entire, each segment in the digital market, and they make it impossible for any SME in Europe to compete. There's no way to get better alternatives as it is today. And we have also seen, and it's pretty clear that this is happening, that what many people think will be the next big industry, AI, we have to see if that's real or not, but if it is going to be the next big industry, we already know who will own it. It's the same people who owned the web. There's no difference, and those structures are now pretty well established. And this leads us to horseman 5 of the 6. There's a lot of fear that AI will displace jobs. And that fear may be well placed. Let's see. In some cases, it has happened already, and let's see if it happens in other cases. What is almost inevitable, I think, however, is that a larger share of the human workforce will very soon find itself being managed by AI. So if you get to keep your job, you will very often find yourself being managed by a system that you are not allowed to understand, not allowed to know. You could think of it, the way Barry Lynn would put this is, we're used to We're used to price discrimination. We don't like it, but you're about to get wage discrimination. And I think that issue about an inhuman system that manages an increasingly large share of the workforce will be an absolutely seismic threat to social order. We're starting to see workplace surveillance emerge. Are you tapping your keyboard a few times an hour? That kind of thing. If you talk to people in some industries, that's already happening. How will people react when an AI manager that they cannot engage with, they can't go for a drink with, for example, decides that they can't take time off to deal with a child who's sick? I don't think they'll react well. And I think if anything gets people out on the street, that will. So before I give you the final horsemen of the apocalypse, let's just run through the first 5 so we know we're dealing with a substantial set of issues together.
I feel like we're in a stampede with all these horses.
I can feel them galloping towards us, but they're not all in a line. Some are further back.
I might never get to sleep again after this.
So the first one is the collapse of information in the democracy. And you can see it, you can feel that already. The second is electoral manipulation. Now, let me just put some flesh on that, since you asked me, and I didn't answer you about examples. We found in 2019, a Polish data broker called On Audience. It's owned by a company called Cloud Technologies. We found that this Polish data broker had marketing material, no longer present, on its website. And it said for the parliamentary elections, they had built a database of several million people who were sympathetic to LGBTQ plus issues. And they had used that database to nudge those people to get out and vote. Now, that sounds quite worthy from a liberal perspective. And in fact, it was funded partly by the European Commission. But I don't think at a time when Poland had safe areas, so-called, this is what they were called, right? This isn't my language. Safe areas where you could be safe from homosexuals. This was official policy at that time. I don't think it was safe to build a database of several million people who were likely to be gay. And that's what they did, and that was normal, and that went onto a PDF on their website saying, hey, this is what our capability is. So they claimed they had a material effect on that Polish election, and I'm sympathetic to their cause, and that sounds like a positive thing.
Johnny, sorry for interrupting, but
yeah.
Do we have any indication that in fact it did have an impact on the election? I mean, the Lublin area safe zones, or gay-free zones, as some call them. But strangely enough, they actually did remain, and they, did not change. I mean, even under a lot of political and European pressure. Do we know that, in fact, this process did have an impact on how elections went afterwards?
I think their claim was that it did have an impact. I think their claim was that this was money well spent. Now, I can't get under the hood of the Polish elections and know that for certain.
And just to be clear, what you're saying here, because you were already hinting at, but I think it's important to be on the nose about what you're saying. The danger of creating a list of people that might be of one persuasion or another, or one ideological position or another, is that it can be used for so-called good, depending on your political perspective, one day, and fall into the wrong hands another day and be used as a tool of persecution. I mean, if we're talking about lists of people, we're getting to like Nazi-era registrations of people of various persuasions.
Yes.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I want to kind of bring this to its logical conclusion of what you're saying.
William, that's exactly right. And since you mentioned Nazi Germany, there was a time when Interpol had a database of persons of interest, ne'er-do-wells. And then Anschluss happened, and that fell into the hands of the Nazis. Similarly, there was a scandal that when the US withdrew from Afghanistan, they left behind them their biometric scanners, which they were using to verify the identity of informants. And those scanners fell into the hands of the Taliban. So, yes, some of these things can be dangerous when used the wrong way. The problem is, this profiling of the electorate is dangerous, probably full stop, when it's leaked out to innumerable parties. You can forget any illusion of control that you might experience when you click those ridiculous pop-ups. The do you accept that these 500 people get your data? We just actually had a victory at the European Court a few months ago on exactly that point. And those pop-ups will hopefully in the next half year now become a thing of the past or be radically changed. So what we've had is a strange situation where we've got the first five horsemen. We've got the collapse of information in our democracy, broken ad market, and toxic algorithms on social media amplifying the worst stuff. Then we've got the broken ad market allowing the entire electorate to be profiled by anyone who wants to pay for that. So we've got the risk of electoral manipulation. Then we've got the security hazard of the data free-for-all. And that data free-for-all happens on our streets and it happens on our devices. Then we've got the broken market, which prevents better alternatives from emerging and is a disaster for European competitiveness, of course. And then we've got this issue of AI and labour, which is not limited to job displacement. It's also about management of humans by unanswerable devices. Now, all of those five horse persons of the apocalypse, in each of their forms, is enough to be a major issue. Together, they are seismic, and all of them involve using computers, big computers, to do things that the computers should not be doing. Shouldn't be doing it for legal reasons. And when that happens, it creates a huge amount of energy use and a huge amount of heat. Carbon is the last horse person of the apocalypse. All of this stuff is massively inefficient. It's processing that should not be happening, and it's contributing to the wider crisis. So we've got this it seems like they're diverse issues, but they are very deeply connected. Collapse of information and protecting our children, that's part of the algorithm problem. Electoral integrity, tech monopolies that cannot be contested. Security and war vulnerability, big labor problem coming on the way, and then carbon.
This is our techno-feudal present. I would like to hope it's a future, but I get the feeling that it really is our present already.
So some of it is here, but we haven't yet felt it all. And I think, yeah.
Sorry. I just here. We cover a lot of Europe and technology and things of the kind. And I must say that, hearing you, of course, as I said, this has been making me lose sleep before I have heard some of the details. Reading the article, the force of the dystopian future does not fully hit you. What I'm wondering is whether you think that Europe is in any way prepared. The sense that I have, and let me just share it, not that you asked me, but is that there are a lot of people not only sleeping at the switchboard, but that by and large, as you cross the parliament or the commission or the council, you deal with a lot of people that have quite simply no idea of where things stand and no idea how to deal with the things that they know that are problematic. What is your assessment of where Europe stands in relation to tackling these issues?
Let's be positive about this.
Must.
Thank you. Please.
Well, I think we need to be. The reason why the next leadership of the Commission has to consider these 6 things together is because they have to be among the grand challenges that this Commission faces. So it should be in the top 5, if not a little bit higher. Now, it's competing with really serious crises. And you're asking, does Europe have the tools? Europe has the tools. We have all the tools we need to solve these problems. The real question is, will the next Commission have the will? That's the question. Now, let's get a little bit wonky before we answer the will question. Often, you have different bits of a European Commission, different directorates general, and different units within the directorates general fighting, squabbling. And sometimes they're fighting with authorities in member states. It is difficult when you try and get humans to work together. and they have competing incentives. So what we need from the next commission, and especially from the next president, is leadership from the very top. And they should be thinking about this in this half-year period before they take up their role, about how they are going to marshal all of the powerful tools at their disposal. And they really do have the tools, and they really do have the law. So,
do you see von der Leyen as either capable or politically willing to take on this?
Well, all I can say is, I suppose, two things. First, I don't think that her term, this first term, if it's the first one, has been a success on the digital side. That, however, does not really have an influence on the second term. She has focused on some other crises. And I think what Europe has proven in the case of, for example, the energy separation from Russia, is that when Europe needs to, she can move fast. She can do it, right? Now, what we need to see, if it's von der Leyen or anyone else, is from the top a mandate through the Commission and monitoring that from the head of the cabinet of the next president. And we need to see a whole of Commission approach. Now, this is a little bit of an institutional revolution. So let me get wonky and describe how that works. I think what I proposed and what the EPP published is that the head of the cabinet for the next Commission president will be the chair of a new task force on these digital issues, right? Media, protecting kids, safeguarding democracy, security, free and open markets, future labour, reducing carbon. And there's representatives from all of the key directorates there. But also, you need a dedicated commissioner to manage this day by day, and that commissioner has to be supported by the Secretariat General. Now, the task force sets the targets to be achieved. And you have cross-commission teams, kind of a matrix structure. We've seen this with the DMA, where you get DGs pushed together to work together. It can work. Cross-commission teams working on each of the 6 areas, and then they have to report regularly to the Parliament and to the Council. Now, on this question of political will, and related to William's question, do we have the tools? Everything I've described, or almost everything, is about data and the use of data. We've got to this bizarre place where the GDPR is now the bane, the terror of the local grocer, of the small sports club, of the SME. And it's the pass-go on the monopoly board card for the biggest monopolists in the world. It seems to be unenforceable in real terms. Forget about the small fines of a few billion. They are small in context. It's unenforceable today against the big players, and yet it's the terror of the small players who actually we're not that worried about. Something got reversed. And when we talk about political will, it's not just that the Commission has to push, as the Biden administration has, across the whole government in a consistent way against monopoly and tech issues. It's that the Commission has to have the political will to put the necessary pressure on Ireland and Luxembourg to enforce where they need to as well. So this is a big project. It's across the structure. It's at the member state level and the Commission level. But we do have the tools to do it, and Europe can do it.
Johnny, I want to pick up on this idea of will and play a little bit of devil's advocate with you, because I think the counter argument to all of this is, regardless of what the EU does and enforces and what regulations they put in place, the US and China are moving full steam ahead on AI issues, on essentially, quote unquote, the future, right? This is an unstoppable train, and the EU has to get on board or get run down by the train and get left behind in terms of economic growth, prosperity, etc.
Yeah.
So I wonder, that's kind of that's the counter argument. I'm wondering what your response to that is.
Yeah, I understand the argument. I've worked in several startups. Before I joined this civil society organization, the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, sounds like an NGO, doesn't it? It is an NGO. But before I joined this NGO, I'd been through several industries. And my last job was working for the guy who invented JavaScript at a company called Brave in Silicon Valley. So I get that argument. I understand it well. The argument says, we can't have rules. because instead we want innovation. Well, that argument didn't go to history school. Plenty of innovation came only because of rules. If we had no regulation, we'd have no Google, because Microsoft would have killed them in the cradle. If we'd had no rules, we'd have no Microsoft, because AT&T would have killed that whole sector. Wouldn't have been that boom. So rules can work, and rules do work. I've worked in several companies that were nuked because the big players weren't forced to obey the rules.
Right, but I think my bigger question is the rules applying to everyone. That isn't this for as difficult as it is to get the EU to agree on anything. This is really about getting the US and China. Because everyone has to, because the tech companies are basically American, right? And then obviously secondary China. So I see what you're saying about the rules, but if the US isn't going to follow them and China's not going to follow them, the EU's just kind of left behind in a sense.
Okay, so maybe there's two parts to the answer. Let's see if I can get through both of them. The first assumption is what AI needs is plenty of data without any restraint, and then you get more AI. Actually, that's not the case. There are different systems of AI, different disciplines, actually several totally different disciplines. And for most of them, you're familiar with the phrase, crap in, crap out. That's a real thing for most AI. So having a free-for-all of data does not get you where you need to get to. Right? That's a false assumption that only applies in one subset of AI. And yet that does seem to be a kind of a pervading illusion that many European enforcers and legislators have in their minds. They don't have the confidence of the convictions that their forebears gifted them with. That's a problem. Europe needs to remember that it is Europe. The second part is a little bit, if we riff a little bit on Macron's Sorbonne II speech, the world was open and we were open and the world closed and we're still open. What are we doing? And why don't we play by the new rules? Why do we get feisty and tough? Well, let me explain what the new rules are in this domain. In, I think, 2021, Biden issued an executive order that said the old Reaganite policies of so-called efficiency and the consumer welfare standard are bunk. We're not doing them anymore. We are going to force these big companies to behave. We're going to rein them in, and we are going to incentivize the growth of young and new innovative entrants. And we're going to make sure that consumers of services and products are respected and offered diverse offerings, more interesting offerings. And in the executive order, if I recall, it says that will keep us secure, it'll keep us diverse, it'll stop one or two big players controlling our media and what we see and hear. That executive order, which was largely drafted by Tim Wu, who's written a lot about these areas, that should be very, very comfortable ground for Europeans. Now, we're not, I don't think, suggesting that we should take the Chinese approach. I don't think anyone in Europe is saying that at this point. And yet, there's the kind of specter, China's coming. But actually, the model has been shown by the Biden administration, and that model is very European in tone. So, on the one hand, more data is not actually a win for Europe. Having a data free-for-all is a problem, and it'll kill our industries of media, and it'll harm our elections, and it will really hurt us in national security.
Johnny Ryan, thank you very much for being with us. That was absolutely fascinating. We hope to have you.
And terrifying.
And terrifying.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, William.
Okay, so we're done. We just, I think that it uploaded almost completely, so we can just hang up. It will be out on Wednesday.
Okay, great.
And I will send it to you. It was just fantastic.
That was
great.
That was easily one of the most interesting interviews we've had.
However,
you really
great. Well, thank you very much.
I'm never talking to you again.
Exactly.
So that was quite fantastic. I thought absolutely off-putting, depressing. I really have lost both my appetite and the capacity to sleep at night, but it was an absolutely brilliant interview. So with that, let me ask you, what do you have coming up next in the next couple of days or weeks?
Besides like the downfall of democratic governance and free elections thanks to all of our internet use, and aside from that, well, I guess sort of related to that, I find so interesting that the United States is stepping into this Georgia situation. Just a couple weeks ago, in a previous episode, we talked about how Georgia passed this foreign agent law that is sort of a very Russian, Putin-style way to crack down on Western NGOs and journalists and maybe have an impact on free media, something along the lines that we see in Hungary, despite massive popular protests in Georgia. And the thing that stood out to me most of all was how feckless the EU seemed to be. Even though Georgia is a candidate country to join the EU, you'd think that therefore the EU would have some leverage over Georgia, and that has not come to pass. And here comes the United States, yes, a superpower, but still far away from tiny Georgia, and essentially offering Georgia a legislative bribe in the form of economic and security support in exchange for doing away with this foreign agent law. Essentially, like, be the good guys, stay good, do the good thing from a Western liberal perspective, and we'll give you all this money, right? The EU has been very good at that in terms of keeping migrants back. I mean, it's essentially the same idea of migrant cash for migrants, but this is cash for liberalism, let's say. And it doubles down on this question of where is the EU? Like, I have this feeling, I was thinking about this as I was riding the train back to The Hague today, and I was thinking, I have this feeling right now about the EU, much in the way I remember feeling in the Obama years, where there was all this hope and promise of the Obama administration doing some really great things, and everyone kind of kept waiting for that to happen, and except for all the nice flowery rhetoric, a lot of it didn't happen. And I feel like we're waiting in the same way for the EU to kind of fill this role as this great bastion of liberalism and freedom and prosperity for us all, and just constantly falling down on the job.
You have to admit, though, that there is great comedic value to the fact that you have a law against foreign financial influence, which is being essentially fought back by offering a massive amount of foreign financial influence, right? I think that's actually a pretty good way to approach it. It's like, you don't like it, have
foreign influence or foreign influence.
Exactly. Why not? Anyhow, for me, the story, of course, will remain Gaza. Gaza still sort of looms large. But then there is also the Netherlands, where it turns out that... So there is also the Netherlands, where it turns out that Wilders will be able to form government. It seems, although it will not be Wilders who becomes the prime minister. As of right now, nobody knows who exactly that person will be. But it does seem to be the case, and I think that this is really the bigger story here, that, the Rutte people from the center-right, if you will, have actually broken the cordon sanitaire, as one says, and have actually, essentially admitted to actually make a deal and do business with the extreme right. So, funny enough, the main criticism to the Rutte people making deals with the far right has come from the French, from Macron, who, as far as I can tell, is really in no position to criticize anybody for anybody concerning the right. I mean, he has not... The one thing he has not done is make deals with Rassemblement National and Le Pen, but he has not only taken Le Pen's, essentially, agenda items, he has actually even taken her security policy. There is now sort of full repression against demonstrations in the street. I mean, France is, under Macron, essentially an illiberal central democracy. And it seems that to me, it seems that kind of thing remains a much more dangerous political process to the European project than anything that might come out of the far right at this stage, precisely because it is people like Macron that turn into Rutte, They already have the policy in position, and all they need to do now is bring into the big tent some very unsavory characters, I would say, like Wilders, like Le Pen, now Meloni, who no longer belongs to the far right, but now she's a good Democrat, and so on and so forth. So this is a project for next week. Let's just move on to our outro, if you will.
Well, that's it for this week's Euroscopic, written by us, produced by us, and edited by Martin. You can catch us every week either at our Substack, euroscopic.substack.com, or on euobserver.com. We'd love to hear from you, so be sure to subscribe and share your thoughts. Many thanks to Johnny Ryan for giving us so much of his time going through the 6 horsemen of the digital apocalypse. Till next time, I'm William Gluckroft.
I'm Martin Gack.
Thanks for listening.